King of Prussia Plaza opening in 1962, Norristown was on a downhill and an increasingly steep downhill slide. The maximum number of stores in downtown Norristown took place in 1954. It was downhill from every year after that. Wow. And so one of the things that we historians often tend to try to explain to people is the reasons for your problems go a lot further back than you think they do. When I first published this book, the first couple of people to comment on it asked me if I had spoken about Section 8. I said, no, I don't speak about Section 8 because the law was passed in October of 1974 and I declare downtown Norristown dead in 1975. And so, no, it's not in there. And so what I began to think a bit was how many of these mistaken, not wrong, but not entirely complete myths, if you will, do local people believe? And the second thing that fascinated me was that virtually everyone whom I talked to, I gave a number of talks about the book a couple of years ago, did not want to just know about the history. They wanted to see how history would help make things better in their town in the future. That lesson stuck with me. And I ended up writing this book. It's about the 8 boroughs, or well, Norristown is a municipality, on the lower Schuylkill River between Reading and Philadelphia. Now, for those of you who are good at geography, I did not include Birdsboro, simply because it's way up in Berks County and it's not oriented towards southeastern Pennsylvania the way the rest of these always have been. And so as I looked at these 8 towns, what I discovered first was that there are people in all 8 of them who are not happy with the way things are, and that they want to change things. And so I set myself to work trying to prepare people with a basic historical understanding of why things really did get the way they did. And so I produced this book. And in the research, one of the things, by the way, I noticed is, in another myth that people tend to have, is that none of these 8 towns are particularly unique. In fact, if you pass on local geographic variations and population, they're all the same. They all are built to the same pattern. And I can go into that a little bit later, but it's usually something that I don't like to spend too much time doing about now. People usually look at me when I say that, but it's true. Not only that, they all followed the same historical arc from the moment of their founding and then the arrival of the railroad, which was the key to the growth of each. Okay? They all had an overall upward arc throughout their history. Now, there are ups and downs during that because this is capitalism. You find things, changing around. But overall, it was always up. Now, even we can even consider the Great Depression as a temporary down because it went back up again with the Second World War and the return of orders for materials and things of this sort. Then, sometime after the Second World War, within usually 2 decades, all of them began to fall, again in unison, and all for the same reasons. Manufacturing was always the core of these towns. Manufacturing left. Well, in fact, it shut down, of course, because it was replaced by largely foreign manufacturing. The local downtowns, which had been the community gathering places and virtually the monopoly places to shop for over 100 years, virtually all collapsed. The younger people left for the automobile suburbs, and some of the older ones also. And then, after 1980, sometime after 1980, and I pick 1980 as historians do, we like round numbers for turning points that don't necessarily have any significance in and of themselves, just that things around them happened. And so I tentatively offered 1980 as a point after which, for the first time in their history, the arcs of these towns diverge. Now, 5 of them, Pottstown, Spring City, Royersford, Norristown, and Bridgeport, are still in a state of what I broadly term stagnation. Phoenixville, well, it's one of the 10 hippest places to live in Pennsylvania or something along that line. And you all know, I'm sure, whether you live there or whether you've driven through or tried to drive through, you know what's happening in Conshohocken and in West Conshohocken. And it's very different from what's happening in Phoenixville. And so as I looked at this, what I asked the basic historian question, well, why should this be? Why should things be different in one town or in this town? Now, Conshohocken is pretty obvious. It's because it sits at the intersection of two interstate highways. And if there's a historical truth that has been true since we began to walk erect, it's that whenever two transportation routes intersect, the area around that intersection develops into something different from the general countryside. Whether you have an ocean and a river, two rivers, two roads, a river and a, whatever combination you want, that has always been true. So this is simply the repetition, a modern repetition of a very, very old historical process. And so the book itself was written as History 101 because, as I said, so many people want things to be better, but they also don't understand why things went wrong in the first place. And if you aim at the wrong targets, if you aim at myths, you're going to fail. You're not going to make the kind of progress that you want. And so it's very simplistically written, at least for me. I try to tone down my academic nature as much as possible because I conceive of it as a community college course. I'm a frustrated teacher. I moved to San Francisco a few years ago and haven't taught since because when you start all over again, things change. But this particular course is the origin of my work comes from the fact that I taught at community colleges for a number of years. And one of the fascinating things I learned about community colleges as opposed to conventional colleges and universities is that no one in a community college is there just to learn. They're not tabula rasa, waiting, you know, I can give some large explanation of something to. They are specifically there to do something, to make something better for themselves. Okay, they took my course in the history of Western civilization because they needed credits in that field and the time of the course worked for them. That's pretty much it. And so I learned a number of years ago that if you're going to teach history to people, you have to teach the history that's relevant, not just the history. I always used to, for example, pass out a date sheet in every one of my courses the very first day. Every single possible date they could possibly want is there on a sheet, and I would tell them, if you don't write anything else on this, you may have it out and use it during exams. Because the last thing I want is for you to lose your train of thought because you can't remember some damn date. If you want to remember a date, do what a historian does. Look it up. I don't have any dates memorized. I deliberately try not to do it. Because the only question in history is why? Why did these things happen? And because I have structured this book, I'm attempting to make history useful and practical for urban activism. On the theory, again, that if you continue to attack the wrong targets, you're going to continue to fail. And the fact that we have 5 towns still in pure stagnation, I think, indicates that that's basically been happening. Now, the basic lesson of this book is that things change. It's a history book, but it's also about the present and the future. Because if things didn't change, there'd be no history, only genealogy. But because they do change, that's what you need to understand. It's all very good to remember this old person in that old store and all this sort of thing. It's great stuff. I do it myself. But if you want to know why, then you're beginning to look really at history itself. Now, the book itself is a thematic history. I did a lot of thinking, and I tried to come up with the 3 most fundamental realities of life along the river. It's not complete by any means. This is an introductory work, and I make that very clear. But those 3 fundamental realities are, first, the river itself, the thing which everyone has in common. Transportation, which has always determined the level of economic success in these towns. And people, by which I broadly mean the arrival of people over history, of new peoples from different lands into the area. The history of the Schuylkill Valley is a history of the arrival of people. First Penn's people from Northern Europe, then those Irish, you know, those Catholics that the original people looked at and said, oh my goodness, these little animals are going to take our jobs, and they're criminals, and so on and so forth. And then they arrive and get established, and of course, when their descendants are now people of importance in the community, the new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe begin to arrive. And guess what? They're now taking the jobs. And they're the criminals. And so the children of the immigrants themselves are the ones who hate the new immigrants because they come from somewhere else. Now, this is not a down or a type of reality. It's a very important reality. Now, those three realities, the important thing to remember is that during the 20th century, all three of them changed. Not only did they changed 180 degrees. The very first of them to change was the reality of people itself. With the First World War, immigrants stopped coming in, obviously. And then, after the Second World War, our Congress, in one of its periodic nativist fits, decided they were going to try to freeze the population by keeping out the ethnicities that had not yet come in and limiting the ethnicities that were already in, so we didn't change anything in the overall structure. Well, you see how well that worked. Okay. Now, in fact, it worked all too well during the 20th century, okay? Because the thing that really regenerated and it continually sent these towns to a higher level was the arrival of the new people themselves. And when that ceased, then the periodic infusion of energy from the people who will come and do the worst jobs just so their children can have a success later on, this kind of desire, this kind of drive, that stopped in the Schuylkill Valley completely until fairly recently. As we all know, we have a brand new ethnicity coming in. It has an issue that the others did not have to face, the question of legality, of course, but that's not going to be decided down here. That's going to be decided elsewhere. But you see, throughout the 19th century, it was the changes of people that drove the prosperity of the Schuylkill Valley. During the 20th century, things hardened and solidified, and the groups within these towns continued to worship at their own church and not vote for people of another ethnicity and this sort of thing. Now, the only reality that changed for the better during the 20th century was the reality of the river. Now, back in the good old days, turn of the century, when everybody had a job and all of this good stuff, the Schuylkill River was little more than an open sewer. You brought the products into the factories, you processed them, and then you dumped the waste right directly into the river, and you kept on doing it. Whether it was coal or from manufacturing waste or human waste, just run it right down the gutters into the river for a very long time. Now, people began slowly to recognize this problem, and in the middle of the 20th century began to do something about it. But the effort really had to wait till after the Second World War, when the state processed a program to remove coal comb from the river itself. And the government started laying mandates for sewage treatment and so on and so forth. Now, of course, the cleaning of the river was helped by a most unfortunate circumstance. Most of the businesses that polluted the river closed down. And so you have things improving, which is on one hand, but not necessarily improving in the other. Now, the third reality to change during the 20th century was the reality of transportation. Prior to the 20th century, every time a new transportation mode showed up in the Schuylkill Valley, it improved the lot of the people in the towns in the valley. From those first terrible roads and fords to bridges and better roads, the Schuylkill Navigation Canal System, and then the big one, the railroad, the one that really prompted everything, because every one of these Schuylkill towns is a railroad town. That's why they are laid out the way they were. And so the transportation reality, when you change from the railroad to automobiles, okay, this is the first change in mode of transportation that adversely affects the towns. Prior to the replacement of the railroad, it was the railroad that connected the towns to each other and the towns to the wider world. It brought products in from as far as they needed, and it shipped them as far as you could sell them. It was entirely a very integrated type of thing for the towns themselves. But once the railroads failed and automobiles took over, the new automobile suburbs sprang up, the shopping centers, so on and so forth, the towns along the Schuylkill River found themselves isolated from everything. They're close, but they're not directly connected. And so after the Second World War, we have one positive change, but then the second really negative change in transportation more than negates this. Then we throw in the problems of collapse of American steel industry and all of these others that you're familiar with. And so the point is that they have changed. Now, The river, as I said, the big change, it's now clean. This has a 180-degree change that follows from it. In the old days, priority for the floodplain was industry and the railroad and transportation. The only people who lived along the river were those who couldn't afford to live anywhere else. The bums, the transients, the day laborers. It was awful. The river was awful. It smelled. The machinery was going 24 hours a day. It just wasn't a nice place to live. You can measure the relative wealth of the inhabitants of every town back in those days by the distance that they built their house away from the floodplain, and usually up a hill. The further away, the more wealth they had. It was that simple. Because back in the old days, everyone walked to do virtually everything they had to do. They got out of their homes, they walked to work, then they walked home. Their wives walked to shopping, then they walked home. Together they walked to worship, and then they walked home. That's why these towns are so compact the way they are. And thus, when the second reality changes and automobiles start becoming important, you find yourself owning a piece of property that was not designed to accommodate an automobile in a town that was not designed to accommodate an automobile. And if you and your spouse both work, in these cases pretty much everybody does, you need 2 cars. Where are you going to put them? And when they're out on the road, in the streets of the town, then you have a serious problem. Now this is, while we can talk about the positive change in the river and maybe the positive change in people, it's a little bit early to say one way or the other, we can definitely talk about the continued negative effect of the automobile. Because everybody who wants to make their town more prosperous, or people coming in and visiting, so on and so forth, are going to have to accept the fact that they're going to arrive by the automobile. That's all, the vast, vast majority. Now, I think something like 20% of the people supposedly come in on the train to Conshohocken. I read that figure. I'm a little uncertain as to whether that's correct or not. But if it is, I'm really pleased that it is. But it's not going to get much higher until they really can do something with the railroads. And so when I talk about transportation, the phrase I use is the transportation conundrum. Meaning there is no easy answer to this. We can look and say the river is great, and we can look and say, let's take these new people coming in, and let's accept their energy and their enthusiasm, and let's put it to work. But when it comes to automobiles, we pretty much have to plan for automobiles. Conshohocken and Norristown have the remnants, if you will, of the old railroad system, but that's about it. So these are the challenges that people face in these towns. And it's for these people, the town activists, that I wrote this book. And that's why I'm here, because in my opinion, there is no more important group of town activists than a Rotary Club. You know, they might not see you out in the street waving signs and yelling at people or something like that. But in this market economy, any revival of any town has to be based on business. There's simply no question about it. And so that's why I consider you people doing exactly what you do to be activists for your town. That's why I'm here, and that's why I hope that many of you will take a look at this book and continue your activism, hopefully perhaps directed even more efficiently from reading the book itself. So thank you very much for my invitation, and I thank you also for what you as an organization do on a regular basis.